Really excited about today's topic. I guess I say that every time I talk about personal finances. But today we're going to be diving into, how you can understand and take control of your personal finances. Really to set some context here, this is week 1 of our 5-part series, kind of the back to school theme of, virtual learning or distance learning is kind of the style these days. And I figured this would just be a really good opportunity to, take that same approach as adults and have a back to school type of approach to, take control of our personal finances in general. So today we're starting with, I think, the key first step that some people, breeze right on by, and that's really how do you understand what's going on with your money? How do I compare? What should I do next? And then over the course of the next 4 weeks, we're going to talk about specific topics that will be applicable based on, kind of building off what you're going to be focusing on. So quick kind of background about myself. My name is Walsh. I lead the planning team here at SoFi. So really at a high level, that just gives me the opportunity to listen in and talk to my planners that talk with thousands of members just like y'all on a regular basis and kind of figure out, okay, what's going well with people, what are challenges people are facing, and then really kind of brainstorm with the planners to find out, okay, what are some best practices that we can, talk about at a larger scale like this. I am a certified financial planner. I do consider myself a planning nerd, so that's probably why I really enjoy talking about stuff like this, and I love the questions that we got in ahead of time. Before we dive into today's agenda, just, some housekeeping type stuff. Number one, even though I am a certified financial planner, nothing we talk about today is financial advice. Look at this as education, as guidance, stuff like that. Nothing, we don't know enough personal information about you to say, okay, hey, you should do this or you shouldn't do that, from that perspective. Some other housekeeping stuff, we are going to send out, our page is going to send out the recording after the session so you can get that. But since we can't talk about specific advice on today's webinar, if you want to schedule a call and kind of get into the, the weeds on your own circumstances, you can always have a complimentary call with one of our financial planners. So you can go to sofi.com/SoFinancial. So at a high level today, really what we want to kind of go through throughout today's session is, hey, step number 1, what are some best practices and some key things that we should be paying attention to as we look to start understanding and organizing our finances? There's some different ways that we can do that and some different things that we should be paying attention to. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach with anything related to personal finances. And that includes something as, uniform as, organizing and understanding your finances. And then we'll dive into, okay, once we understand what's going on with our money, how do we assess where we stand so we can kind of get some baseline in place so that way we can kind of know where to go. And then finally, how do we take this and start moving forward and determine your next money move or the best use of your next dollar. So that's kind of how we'll break out today's session. And then leave plenty of time for questions and answers. If you have questions, toss them in the Q&A. We also got a fair amount of questions in the registration. Thank you for that. I was reading those ahead of time, and there's some awesome questions in there, so I want to make sure that we have time to get to plenty of questions because they are really good. Okay, so the first, section of this is going to be, how do you understand and organize your finances? And before we hop into this, I think it's always helpful to understand where you all stand and what you're coming into this with. So I'd love to, if you could just add it in the chat, how do you stay on top of your finances right now? So if you use Excel or pen and paper, put in A. B, if you use an app such as Mint or hopefully SoFi Relay, a little bit biased there. Or C, don't track my finances at all. I'd love to just get a high level understanding. So feel free to toss it on in there. Oh man, these are coming in hot and heavy. I can't keep up with these. Okay, so we're seeing some A's, some C's, some A's, a little bit of A and B. Okay. So for the most part, it's looking like A or C. And I know, this isn't statistically significant or anything. We're just going through this rather quickly. But I think that's helpful perspective to have, knowing that it's, relatively A or C, a few people using B. anything that we talk about today and the different aspects and understanding and organizing your finances, you can use, an old school or manual type of approach, using Excel, using a pen and paper. You can use an app such as, SoFi Relay. There's different ways to go about doing it. At the end of the day, it's finding out what fits best for you and what the pros and cons are and how you can use that to get on top of your finances. So we can kind of talk about that throughout, but there's some different options that you have. So there we go. Okay, so at a high level, when it comes to understanding your finances, I think, a lot of times people make it pretty complicated when they're looking at it. And it's not, we want to try to simplify things as much as possible when it comes to personal finances. So I think, at a high level, we're looking at what do I own, what do I owe, and what do I spend? Don't get me wrong, there's extra levels of detail that we can get into when it comes to getting into our finances. We can break down every single one of these buckets. We can look at, asset allocation and what's my overall investment mix, getting into nitty-gritty with, liabilities, getting into a very detailed approach to, where's every single one of my dollars going. But at a high level, I think it's important for people to take a step back and say, hey, Kate, what do I own, owe, and spend? And if I have a good idea with that, those are going to be the three key components of my personal finances. So that way I can develop that overall understanding. So I want to break each one of these down because I think there's some things that people should especially pay attention to as they're both, developing and getting everything organized, and then also things to pay attention to as you're getting an understanding of each one of these components. So the first one is, ultimately like, hey, at the end of the day, what do I own? At a high level, we really kind of break these down into 5 different buckets under what you own. Number one would be cash. That's going to be anything in your checking account, your savings account. It could be high yield savings. It could be a cash management account. It could be a money market. It could be a CD. That's all going to be, cash or cash equivalent. And at the end of the day, we want to pay attention to what that amount is because that's going to be, ultimately what we need to, or what we could spend if expenses kind of come up out of nowhere and we need to be liquid. So let's say if an emergency comes up or what we pay our bills out of on a month-to-month basis, that's really coming from that cash bucket. The next bucket under what you own is really going to be your investment. So typically we look at that as, let's say, your taxable investment. So if you have a brokerage account, or if you have a robo account or 529 account, or different accounts like that are going to be invested. So they're, typically going to be in the stock market or even in fixed income or maybe cryptocurrency, but they're not really designated for retirement. They're just more general purpose. Then we put those in the investment bucket. Third, we have retirement accounts. So that would be, your 401k, your 403b, your IRAs. So people have, pension plans, things like that. That would be in your retirement accounts. And then the bottom, we have personal property, which would be, car, collections, things like that. Not really, liquid. It adds to your net worth, but it's not really going to be usable for the most part. And then finally, real estate. So that could be a house, maybe a vacation property. And the reason why we break this down into these 5 buckets, and we encourage people to do that as they're going through organizing their finances, is because someone with let's say $100,000 worth of, what they own or worth of assets is not always going to be the same. So someone with $100,000 in cash is typically going to be in a much different position than someone with nothing in cash and $100,000 in real estate or $100,000 in personal property. So we'll touch on the ways that we're going to assess our personal finances in the next section, but that's why it's important to kind of take this step by step and say, okay, what do I own in each one of these buckets to get that solid understanding of how my, overall my assets are going to be kind of categorized. Next, we move on to the other side of the balance sheet, which is going to be what you own, or sorry, what you owe. Both those words with one letter switched. I'm sure it will not be the last time I mess that up. But, these could be, debts, liabilities, whatever you want to call it. It's essentially you owe money to someone. So again, I think it's important here to break these down into different categories because not all debt is created equal, just like not all assets are created equal. So we typically look at credit cards, we look at personal loans, we look at auto loans, we look at student loans, we look at home loans. Granted, there can be some other forms of debt, and we typically kind of put those in different buckets depending on what they're most similar to. like let's say like payday loans or medical debt or things like that. Like typically we just, lump those in the personal loan category. But at the end of the day, we look at this to say, okay, what's my overall debt mix? Again, someone with $100,000 of debt is not going to be the same across the board. So if someone has $100,000 credit card debt, they're going to be in a much different position than someone who has a $100,000 student loan or $100,000 home loan or mortgage. So it's important to look at these different buckets and see, okay, what does this exactly mean? So it's not just a top line number of what do I owe, but also those different components inside what I owe. And then finally, we have what you spend. I think this is the most interesting one for me because I think it's, whether you call it a budget or, your spending or whatever it may be, this is the topic that probably gets talked about the most and gets the most pushback. I feel like for some people, like budgeting is like a four-letter word, but I just absolutely hate it. I'm probably one of those people, by the way. I really dislike budgeting just because it's kind of a painful exercise the way I used to do it, and I do it a little bit easier now. But when it comes to what you spend, early on, what we encourage people to do is take a step back and look at, hey, what have I been spending over the last 1, 2, 3 months, especially if this is your first time, analyzing your spending and developing a budget, which there were a lot of people who had the C response that said, hey, I don't track my finances. This would apply to you. And typically, I think the easiest way is to break this down into 5 different buckets. If you're more detail-oriented, you can go granular and you can have, 30 different categories and everything like that. But for the most part, we find that money goes to 1 of 5 different places. Number 1 would be debt payments. So these are things that you have to pay. That would be student loan payments, credit card payments, car loan payments, mortgage payments, any sort of debt payments, that goes in the debt payment bucket. Your essential expenses would be things that aren't debt payments, but are still absolute necessities. So these are going to be your basic living expenses. So to think about that, that would be, groceries, gas, basic utilities, stuff like that. And then you have your discretionary expenses. This is probably the one that's the most questionable because it varies from person to person. Some people's discretionary item is another person's essential item. But this would be things that are nice to have. So this could be gym memberships, going out to eat. I use myself as an example. I have Hulu, Prime, and Netflix. Those are definitely discretionary items when you have all 3. If you ask my wife, they might be essential because we have 2 young children. And when they want that specific show, might be an essential expense. 4th category is waste. And I think this is an interesting one to include when you're looking at what you spend, because a lot of people think that they don't have waste. And everyone has a certain amount of waste in their budget. And the key is to identify it and figure out if it's an acceptable level, and then try to get rid of it as much as possible. So it's identifying those waste expenses. Perfect example of that could be, using my same examples for, the Netflix, the Hulu, and the Amazon Prime, that could be considered waste because it could be 3 of the same thing, or it could be subscriptions that I don't use, different things like that. And then finally, the 5th category of spending would be what you're putting towards your goals. So this is ultimately, in my opinion, the most important aspect of tracking your spending is how much money am I setting aside towards the goal that I'm focusing on. And this isn't always a savings goal. A lot of times people think that this is, the money that they're putting aside in their 401k and their IRA or their savings account. Some people are focused on building up, their cash cushion, and this would be what goes towards their savings account. Some people are focused on paying down their debt, so this would be their excess debt payments. And some people are focused on investing towards the future, so this would be their, their investments towards their, their retirement accounts. But either way, it's helpful to look at your past spending, see what's going on, identify opportunities for improvement, and really kind of develop a plan moving forward on how you're going to track that spending, how it aligns towards your goals. So we kind of talked about the basics of, okay, let's figure out how we get organized, what are the things that we should pay attention to as we're understanding our finances. And I think going through that process of, okay, what do I own? what do I owe, and what do I spend, and even kind of taking it down into those different categories for each is a really great place to start. And as we're talking to members one-on-one, going through kind of the planning experience, understanding where they stand is very, very helpful. But the next question that normally comes up after people start developing that level of awareness or that level of understanding is, undoubtedly it's something around the lines of, okay, is that good? How do I compare? What does that mean? And those are really, really good questions, because when you just look at numbers on a screen without any context, it's really, really hard to understand how you're doing or what you should be comparing it to. So there's a few different areas that I think are common kind of topics that we address, or key measures that we address when we answer that question of whether it be, where do I stand, how do I compare, how am I doing? And those three areas are probably the three most important areas that we talk about on a regular basis. And number one is going to be spending. Number two is going to be liquidity. And number three is going to be debt. And I think as you're going through this process and you're figuring out, hey, how do I get my finances organized and get an understanding of it, it could be helpful to just go through these three basics, and then you can move on to the other ones as we'll talk through the next, 4 sessions. But these are kind of like the three starting points. So number one, when it comes to spending, I mentioned earlier that I am not thrilled with the idea of budgeting. And that's because for years, I was of the kind of the mindset of, I had this awesome spreadsheet, and I'm an Excel nerd. So, I mean, if anyone wants to compare spreadsheets later, like, that is my jam. But that really wasn't the best way for me to manage my money, because I had like 25, 30 different categories. And then at the end of the month, I'd go into, I don't know if I should say my bank, but I'd go into my bank and I'd see, okay, what am I spending? And I'd put in the categories, I'm adding it all up, and it would take hours and hours and hours. And then I would be like $20 over in one category and $10 under in another category. And it made it really, really time consuming and really, really frustrating. That's why at a high level, my family switched to a simplified approach like this. And we see this as one of the more successful approaches to just getting a high level understanding of, okay, is my spending in check? And then how do I manage that moving forward? And it's the 50-30-20 rule. Essentially, this rule boils down to, how do I do the hand raise thing? Uh-oh, getting distracted, sorry. I will get to the question at the end. So sorry, I don't know how to address the hand raising. So 50-30-20. So it would be 50% of your money every month would go to essential expenses. Those are the must-haves. So that would bump in the debt payments, along with the essential expenses. So food, rent, transportation, basic necessities. 30% towards discretionary items. Those are the nice to have. Those are the things that ultimately make your life enjoyable, but you could do without if you absolutely had to. And then 20% towards your goals. And we see a lot of people find success with this approach because it's just 3 little buckets, and they can funnel their expenses towards this. It's super easy to categorize towards it, but it doesn't fit for everyone. I think that's one approach. If you could explore this 50-30-20 rule, a high level understanding of how your expenses and how your spending is lined up and where you stand with that. At the end of the day, we run into a lot of people whose essential expenses, quite frankly, are more than 50%. And they kind of sit there and they're like, what do I do? Well, you know what, that 20%, the reason it's in purple, and I probably could have picked a more differentiated color, the real key is the 20% and the 80%. So you can even simplify this further and say, okay, where is my money going? Ultimately, it should be 80% spending, 20% towards your goals. And if you're not at that, then it's kind of figuring out, tweaking that on a month-to-month basis. How do I get closer to that, and how do I make progress towards it? Because it's never going to be something where you go from spending more than you make to, okay, I'm going to abide by the 50-30-20 rule overnight. It typically takes a process. So I think that would be the first area, is when you're looking at spending, looking at the 50-30-20 rule to see how your spending lines up towards kind of this baseline and this key measure. Cool. So the next measure that we typically talk to is related to liquidity. And it's kind of interesting. A lot of people, dive into questions right off the bat related to like complicated aspects of personal finances. And so far we've talked about spending, and now we're talking about liquidity. And I think these are, the reason I chose them first and second is because I think they are the two most important things that people can focus on, because your spending and your overall cash flow on a month-to-month basis really controls everything. It drives all of your personal finances, and then your liquidity plays a huge role in not only your financial life, but then your emotional well-being as well. So that's why we cover liquidity. And at a high level, we look at kind of three different ranges. First range we look at is 1 month worth of expenses. So earlier when we talked about, how you organize and understand what you own, one of those categories was cash. And essentially what you should look at is, hey, how much money do I have in cash? And if I didn't have any income coming in, how long would that cash last me? And that's how we figure out how much liquidity we have. I mean, you could have ratios and everything, but it's as simple as that. Cash, how long would it last me? And if your cash would last you less than 1 month, then we consider that to be, a pretty big issue when it comes to personal finances. So that bare minimum for liquidity, 1 month worth of expenses, and we consider that someone's safety net. And really the reason we call it someone's safety net is because it serves as really the cushion or the buffer between something unexpected happening and having very, very negative financial ramifications by dipping into and relying on debt or making drastic cuts or not being able to pay bills, things like that. So that's really kind of that first benchmark for liquidity. The next benchmark for liquidity is looking at having 3 months worth of expenses. And realistically, that's pretty much going to be the ideal, emergency fund for someone who has stable income and who doesn't have any bad debt. That should be kind of the target of how much liquidity, that individual should look to have. And then finally, 6 months worth of expenses. And we find that tends to be the ideal emergency fund for individuals who have less stable income. Maybe they work on commission, or maybe their job is in an industry or a sector right now that is a little bit at risk, and they also don't have any bad debt. So those tend to be the kind of the three ranges we look at when it comes to liquidity. Again, if we see it less than 1 month, then that tends to be a pretty big red flag that we want to focus on. If it's more than 6 months, I'm not saying that's always a bad thing, but unless there's a reason for that excess cash, then we want to investigate that and figure out if that money could be put to better use somewhere else. And then finally, for the third key measure that we talk about on a regular basis to help people understand where they stand is looking at debt. And I mentioned earlier when we were talking about what you owe, that not all debt is created equal. So we have the different categories of debt. And we find that, a lot of people really have negative views towards debt. And it's understandable. I think people just in general don't like owing money. They don't like the monthly payments. They don't like the interest. Maybe I assume that because I don't. But from a financial perspective, when we're taking a step back and looking at it, we really want to assess the debt situation and say, okay, is the debt good debt or is it bad debt? So we view there's a fundamental difference between good and bad debt. Number one, that line in the sand is based on the interest rate. Bad debt has a high interest rate that makes it costly from a financial perspective to carry that from month-to-month basis. And then it also limits flexibility down the road if something does come up and you need to access capital from borrowing. Bad debt typically accelerates consumption and it hinders progress. So typically when we look at bad debt, we think of credit card debt or maybe personal loans, and it can come from myself. I was in my 20s and I made some really suboptimal decisions, racking up credit card debt, living beyond my means. We also see this come into play with people who are forced in a situation where maybe there's a job loss and not an emergency fund, and they're forced to live on credit cards or personal loans. Regardless of the situation, we categorize it as bad debt based on the interest rate. On the other hand, good debt would be an interest rate less than 7%. And the reason we categorize that as good debt is because the long-term historical return of the market is right around 7% adjusted for inflation. So typically, if the interest cost of debt is lower than that, then we look at, hey, maybe it might make more sense to pay that off according to schedule and invest the difference. Whereas bad debt, that never is the scenario. We look at bad debt, and that tends to be one of the first things that we focus on attacking. Perfect. So moving on to the third section, kind of want to get a pulse of the audience here in a minute. As we look at determining your next money move, I think this is the next logical step. Once you understand, okay, here's what I have going on with my personal finances, high level, where do I stand? How am I doing? Things like that. The next question is, okay, what should I do next? And that's where we spend a ton of our time as we're working with clients. So I guess at a high level, I'd love to get a sense from the audience. When it comes to, current priorities, would you say A, building up cash, B, investing for the future, C, paying down debt, or D, a mixture of all three? And there's no right or wrong answers, by the way. Oh man, I really need to think about how to do this so I can read the results. Okay, so we got D, B, D. Okay, so we got, I'm not counting all these, but it looks like there's a mixture across the board, number one, of people, focusing on different things. And it seems like there's a fair amount of people that are focusing on D, but there seems to be a mixture across the board. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Cool. And you know what? That's kind of what I expected, is a mixture across the board. And I think that makes sense because everyone's at different stages of their financial journey. And I think that's why it's so important, as I talked about looking at your spending, and I said money allocated towards your goals. It's not always just money that you're investing for the future. A goal would be building up cash or investing or paying down debt. So what I want to talk through now is just as we're looking at, identifying, your next money move based on where you stand and, how you're doing overall related to your finances, what are some ways that we can think through how we can take control of our finances and strategically approach that next money move to set ourselves up for success? So the first thing I would say is we found working with our members that it's really important for people to narrow your focus. Granted, this is not saying that everyone who responded with D, saying they had a mixture of all those different priorities, I'm not saying you're doing it wrong. I'm saying that we've seen it be more successful for people to narrow their focus. And I'll explain a little bit why I say that. Again, it doesn't work for all people, but it works for many of the people that we talk to. So on the left-hand side, we're, think about a hypothetical example of someone who, every single month, they're like, hey, I'm gonna put $100 to my emergency fund, $200 towards my 401k, $100 towards my credit card, and $100 a month extra towards my personal loan. Like, number one, that's awesome because that person is setting aside $500 towards getting their money right and moving towards, a better financial future. So that's amazing. But when we're taking a step back and looking at it, we would tend to encourage people to consolidate that $500 and say, okay, let's narrow the focus and pick one thing to focus on and put all that $500 towards, let's say, the credit card. And the reason we tend to go that approach is first-hand experience working with members, as well as, just random research about, human behavior, is that when someone's focusing on, 2, 3, 4, 5 different things at the same time, kind of taking the sprinkle approach, what happens is a couple months go by, maybe 4 or 6 months go by, and they tend not to see very much progress. I mean, it's great that they're doing it, but they don't really see meaningful progress. And when they don't see that progress, they tend to get disappointed, and they tend to say, okay, you know what, that vacation I wanted to go on is looking better and better. It's not that big of a deal. On the other hand, when people tend to narrow their focus on one specific purpose, they see progress quicker, and ultimately that progress leads to persistence. That's why we encourage people to at least explore the idea of saying, hey, let's narrow that focus and put all of our energy towards one specific thing, see the progress on that thing. That'll make us increase our persistence. And then when that thing is done, let's move on to the next thing. So just some food for thought for people who are, kind of spreading their money around towards different goals. At the end of the day, hey, if you're setting money towards the future, that's a win. But it may make things a little bit easier. It may make it easier to stick with your goals and your plans by focusing it all on one thing. The downside of focusing on one thing is inherently people are like, hey, what if it's the wrong thing? So we tend to put a lot of thought into this question of like, okay, what should I be focusing on? Because if on one hand, we're going to say, hey, typically we see it, people better off by focusing on one thing because they see progress quicker, then we damn sure better make sure that they're focusing on the right thing or helping them focus on the right thing. And in order to do that, we created, kind of this framework that we use across our financial planning team, and we talk about it in a lot of our webinars, our live streams, our conversations. Really, this is our house view related to how people prioritize their different goals. And it goes as, just like a checklist. So you focus on one, and if you're good on one, you move to two, and so on. You go on down the list. So the first one and the biggest priority, and we mentioned this earlier, is we see as a safety net. And that's 1 month's worth of expenses set aside in cash. And we basically view that as the foundation of financial security in someone's personal finances. So if you don't have that, then we tend to encourage you to focus on building that safety net, whether it be $50 a month, $100 a month, whatever it may be, focusing whatever you can on building that safety net. For someone who does have that, then we move on to step number 2, would be taking advantage of the employer match if it's available. Not everyone has access to an employer match through their retirement plan at work, especially now. That may be, some companies maybe, get rid of that during the tough times and things like that. But if the match is available, essentially that is extremely high rate of return on your money by taking advantage of that match. So we encourage people to do that. If those first 2 steps are good, then we look at, okay, are you protecting your income? If you have dependents, do you have enough life insurance? If you don't have dependents, is your income protected if you get sick or injured, you can't go to work? Do you have health insurance? Stuff like that, making sure that you're protecting your income. Number 4 would be bad debt. Earlier we talked about how we look at bad debt as debt with an interest rate greater than 7%. So if you list out all that debt over 7%, and then just attack that and focus on making extra payments there, ideally one account at a time with the lowest balance among the bad debt, while paying the minimum on everything else. Number 5 would be the emergency funds, that 3 to 6 month worth of expenses that we talked about earlier, depending on if your income's stable, your family size, situation, things like that. Number 6 would be, saving for retirement. So that could be in a 401k, an IRA, you name it. 7 would be saving for other goals. And then 8 would be paying down the good debt. And this tends to be the framework that we work through as we're kind of picking and choosing, like, hey, what should I be focusing on with my money? If there's questions on that, I think there was a handful in the registration, but we tend to see that being the most effective way to kind of prioritize and say, okay, focus on one thing, let's make sure it's the right thing. And then finally, as we look at helping people take control of their finances, I think it's important to, it's one thing to say, hey, I'm on step number 4, where I'm attacking bad debt, or I'm on step number 6, where I'm saving for retirement. But I think it's really important to kind of break that down a little bit, because one of those 8 steps honestly could take you 1, 2, 5, 10 years to kind of go through. I mean, some of those are really, really big, meaty steps. Now, some of the earlier steps, people might be able to get through those quickly, depending on their circumstances. But especially as you kind of progress through those steps, they will take some time. So we find that it's important for people to kind of break down those goals to make it more manageable. So I think, yes, it's focusing on the big picture. What step am I on? But then it's also understanding those key drivers of, what's going to influence my ability to save 15% towards retirement, or, things like that. It's also important as you're going through this process to, if you're working with a professional, like let's say you're working with, a complimentary planner at SoFi, or you're working with someone externally, or even if you're doing it on your own, setting up a cadence to review and check in. That's important to kind of sprint for, let's say, a few months and focus on something, and then say, okay, every 3 months, or every 6 months, or every year, I'm going to pull, I'm going to take a look up and see how I'm doing, see what worked well and what didn't work well, so we can kind of reevaluate. Another tip I think we've seen be successful as people are looking to break down their goals is how do we automate the important? I always throw this one in here because I would say that honestly, if it wasn't for automation, my finances would probably be in a pretty rough spot compared to where they are right now. I tend to automate almost everything. And I know that sounds weird coming from a financial planner. I tend not to like to pay attention to my personal finances. It stresses me out, it causes me anxiety. So what I learned was I had to automate almost everything. So that way I could basically take my behavior out of the picture. And then as soon as I automated things, essentially inertia started working for me. Because in order for me to, just leave it as is, was working towards my goals. And then in order for me to kind of save less money or pay off my debt, at a slower pace, I would have to go in there and make a change. So that really, really helps. And then finally, I think it's helpful to make sure things are realistic. It's one of those things where you want to set ambitious goals, and those are all great, but there's a difference between an ambitious goal and a completely unrealistic goal. And especially knowing how hard personal finances can be for people, it's really tough to set these, unrealistic goals because then you can get, kind of demotivated or lose motivation. So an example for this would be like, let's say a savings goal. And I use this as an example because I don't want to share member details, but I'll share my own information. My focus for 2020, it seems like forever ago when I figured out my plan for 2020, and man, things have changed for sure compared to expectations. But my focus was on saving. So essentially how I said, we got to break it down and understand the key drivers. For me, number one was I had to automate my contributions and my payments. I know that automating the important is absolutely critical, as I mentioned. So that was my first step, was how do I automate contributions and payments to make sure that I can set everything up on autopilot. Then for me, a key driver of if I'm able to hit my savings goal or not is how much I'm spending. So I take a simplified approach when it comes to my spending. I don't even follow the 50-30-20. I just do the 80-20 type of approach, where I say, okay, here's how much money I can spend on a monthly basis. I set that up in SoFi Relay as my spending target, and essentially it kind of tracks towards that. And it says, oh, okay, you're spending too much, you're spending too little. And it's just, I can go in there in 10, 15 seconds and say, okay, how am I doing? And if I'm not doing good, then maybe I'm golfing at, the cheap course instead of the course I want to golf at. Little things like that will allow me to check in along the way with my spending. And it's also important, I think, any lump sums that come into play. So, when bonuses or tax refunds or any other windfalls come into play, the natural inclination is people are naturally more prone to spending that than, their basic, their normal steady, paycheck. So having a plan for that type of stuff ahead of time is a really easy way to take control of your finances. And then finally, I set up benchmarks along the way. So typically what I do is I check in once a quarter. If anything crazy happens, then I'll do it more frequently. So that's the type of, approach that you can take by, translating and saying, hey, here's what step I'm on, and it's related to savings, but that's a big step that's going to take me a long time. Let's break this down a little bit so I know exactly what I can focus on and I can kind of measure that progress along the way. Cool. So I've been talking for long enough about the prepared remarks. I hope you all found that valuable. What I'd like to do now is hop on over to the questions. And then as you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. And then Paige will drop them in the sheet. So don't worry, I'm looking over at the sheet. I have 3 monitors. Okay, so first question that I want to tackle, there was a handful of questions related to budgeting and cash flow. And there's one in there, how do I mentally switch from spending to saving? So I think, the way I approach this, and I think the way that's been helpful for members to approach this before, is to establish a system that's going to make sense for your personality type. And I think in 2 different areas. Number 1, in how you're tracking your spending, and number 2, in how you set up your savings. So when it comes to spending, I think it's important to understand how detail-oriented you are. Some people need the details or love the details. Some people hate the details and won't deal with them. So make sure that the way you track your spending aligns with that. Using myself as the example again, I am not a detail-oriented person when it comes to my personal finances. So the only way I was able to track my spending was to take that spending target type of approach and say, I'm allowed to spend X amount per month. And then all I do is I let the app do the work for me and I check in on that. That works for me. And then the other approach would be on the savings side of things. I think you need to understand and take a step back and say, hey, do I want to control that or do I want to automate that? And you could do a hybrid. Some people end up in the middle, but I know what I need to save, and I know I probably won't do it if it's left up to me. So I like to automate as much as I possibly can, whether it be to my kids' 529 plan, my 401k, my IRA, my brokerage account, whatever it may be. I want to automate that. So that way I have to go in there and turn it off, and it allows me to just budget and kind of build everything, appropriately. So I think I would look at how your personality type is for spending and savings, and then kind of adjust accordingly. Okay, make sure I highlight that so I don't redo it. Okay, next question. Oh man, this is, okay. So do you consider an HSA a retirement account or investment? I picked for this question, I don't know if the person knew this or not, but I have a keen interest in HSAs. I actually did a research paper on HSAs a few years back. And I know that's like the nerdiest thing to admit to a group of people. So HSAs, it all depends on how you're using them, to be honest with you. HSAs to me, number one, you're eligible for an HSA if you're in a high deductible health plan. I don't think anyone should purposely choose a high deductible health plan just to get access to an HSA. But if a high deductible health plan is suitable for you and your family's needs based on medical conditions, income, cash flow, things like that, and you have access to an HSA, then I think ultimately you need to decide how you're going to use it. Some people use it for more from a cash flow perspective, where they use it to cover the out-of-pocket healthcare costs as they're incurred. Because the beauty of an HSA is you can make tax-deductible contributions, it grows tax-free, and then you can take it out tax-free if you use it for qualified medical expenses. So if you're using it for like month-to-month type stuff or year-to-year type stuff, then typically I just kind of view that as another cash type of account, because it's really about liquidity. It's saying, hey, I keep $1,000 here because I plan on having $1,000 worth of out-of-pocket expenses, and that's just how I'm going to do it. Now you can let that money grow from year to year. So if you're approaching it from a long-term planning perspective, you can max out those contributions and let that grow. Then for those purposes, I would probably look at that more as a retirement account, because you can invest that in most HSAs, and the focus is on the long term. So I think it all depends on how you're using it, how I categorize that. Okay, next question. It was related to liquidity, and the question is the 3 months essential expenses or all expenses? That's a really, really good question. And honestly, something we get all the time, because we get pushback on this. And I'm going to say all expenses. And a lot of people push back on that because they're like, hey, if I lost my job or if something happened, I would cut back and I would live just on the essentials. And I agree that people, would probably, try to do that. I've lost my job before, and emotionally, it is depressing enough to deal with that blow. And on top of that, if you take away all the things that you do for fun because you can't have any sort of discretionary spending, then it could really have a much bigger impact on you emotionally. So I think when you're blending the two things, finances and emotion together, we encourage all expenses because we don't want people to be forced to say, okay, I'm only going to eat ramen noodles and I'm not going to do anything social for 3 months until I find another job. So we feel, and we found that it's much more realistic to plan for all expenses rather than just essential expenses. Okay, let's move on to, there's a bunch of people that said that they were balancing things. So Next question would be balancing paying off huge student loans and saving for important events. Is it ever okay not to put every extra penny towards loans? So I think, the answer is it depends. Going back to the idea of good debt versus bad debt, typically when we're talking student loans, they tend to be good debt. Don't get me wrong, there's some student loans with interest rates greater than 7%. But I think that's why it's important to take a step back and say, hey, let's look at all my debt, and is it good debt or bad debt? If it's bad debt, then based on our framework, we want to attack that fairly early on. And if it is bad debt, then we would typically prioritize that over saving or investing for, let's say, retirement, except for the employer match, simply because that interest rate is higher than the long-term rate of return of the market. So if it's bad debt, then we would typically prioritize that higher than saving for and investing for long-term goals outside the employer match. If it's good debt, then typically what we would look at is saying, hey, we could probably pay the minimum on good debt and then use that money towards investing in the future. But there's always exceptions to that rule, but at a high level, that tends to be how we look at it. Okay. Next question. I'm looking to start investing. What's the best way to break into the world of investing? Mutual funds, bonds, other? I think at a high level, we go through a couple different questions as people come to us talking about investing. I think number one is investing the best use of your next dollar. Assuming it is, then we move on. But again, looking at other things like an emergency fund, like paying off bad debt, things like that. But assuming that it's the next best, the use of your next best dollar, then typically what we do is we say, okay, what is this going to be for? I think it sounds somewhat obvious, but it's a very, very important question. Understanding what you're investing for and when you're going to use it. Because ultimately that should kind of determine how much risk you're willing to take. And then from there, it's what type of approach do you want to take in your investing? Do you want it to be active, kind of do it yourself, you're in control? Do you want to take a hands-off approach and kind of automate it through, let's say, like a robo-advisor, or do you want something in the middle? And that's a question that only you can answer if you have the time, talent, the expertise to do it. Most people who are newer might be better served to diversify through, let's say, some sort of automated solution, and based on their level of risk that it's appropriate towards their goals and and towards how comfortable they are with risk. And then maybe take a small portion of that, and they could follow stocks in like a watch list. They could read the news in their SoFi app, whatever it may be, and they can kind of learn with like a smaller portion as they're getting more comfortable. So we see that hybrid approach tend to work for people, but again, it's all based on personal preference, assuming that investing is the right thing for you, and you have your goal in mind, your time horizon in mind, your risk in mind. Okay, next question. I'm pretty sure I know your answer. Is it okay to take good debt to pay off bad debt? Yeah, really, really good question. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I think that could be perfectly okay. Sometimes it's not okay. So I'll kind of talk through the pros and cons of this. And I'll use an example of, probably the most common example that we see of this is bad debt, let's say a credit card with, I don't know, let's call it 20% interest, and good debt, maybe a personal loan at, 6% interest. So that could be a very effective way to accelerate a debt paydown strategy is by saying, hey, I have 20 grand of credit card debt. I'm going to take out a $20,000 personal loan that's charging a much lower interest rate, and it'll allow me to pay off that debt quicker because I'm paying less interest. And that could be a great way to accelerate debt paydown plans using good debt to replace bad debt. Some things that people need to be aware of, though, is you want to make sure that you take that good debt and pay off the bad debt, and you don't have both. And I know that may sound obvious, but you want to do everything you can to make sure that doesn't happen. And number two, I think it's really important to take a step back and say, okay, why did I get into the bad debt to begin with? And is that addressed? Again, people can get into bad debt for overspending or just straight up necessity, especially right now. So not all bad debt's created equal. But if it was overspending, like how I got into bad debt, quite honestly, then you want to make sure you address that spending problem right along with it, because otherwise you'll be in the same spot 2, 3, 4 years down the road. So I think it could be a great strategy. Just make sure you kind of take those precautions along the way. Cool. Next question. We got a few questions in the pre-registration about really about home buying, and I'll kind of combine them into one question. So one of them was asking is about renting versus buying, and the other one was asking about buying a house for the first time. And I think this is a question that we see come up on a regular basis because of what's going on in the real estate market, quite frankly. If you look at the amount of mortgages year over year, it's been, crazy increase. Housing prices, it depends what market you're in. I mean, I know, real estate's heavily localized, but generally speaking, real estate prices are up. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that people, as they're preparing to buy a home, they do it in a kind of a more, systematized manner where they look at saying, okay, how much home can I afford based on my budget, not how much the lender's willing to approve me for, because those two numbers can be very, very different. Lenders will typically approve you for much higher amounts than what will fit comfortably in your budget. So speaking from firsthand experience, when I was looking for my first house, I started looking at houses based on what the lender approved me for. And when you look at very, very nice houses that are really expensive, and then you realize, hey, I should probably dial it back to fit inside my budget, it can be an interesting emotional impact. So figure out what you can afford from a house price based on your budget. And then from there, I think it's building out, okay, how much do I need to save for that down payment in addition to my emergency fund? We want to make sure that we don't deplete our emergency fund in order to make down payments, and also covering the closing costs and all the supplemental costs that come with buying a home. So I think, going through that kind of process is very, very important, rather than kind of diving into real estate decisions, especially now with the way home prices are going. When it comes to timing, the stock market or real estate market, I honestly have no clue what's going to happen to real estate prices in the next 6 months or even 6 years. I will say it's important to really think about how long you're going to stay in the home, because generally speaking, you want to stay in the home for, I don't know, anywhere from 3 to 7 years in order for that break even to actually happen, because you're going to have closing costs when you buy the home, and you would have closing costs when you sell the home. So you'll really want to consider that and how that kind of factors into your future life stages as well. Okay, next question. Why wouldn't step 4, attacking bad debt, precede the safety net? Really, really good question. We had some debates on this as we're kind of going through this framework. I think for a couple different reasons. Reason number one is, from a financial and emotional perspective, having cash on hand to cover unexpected expenses is absolutely critical. So financially, having that cash cushion basically prevents you from being in a cycle of, okay, credit cards, not credit cards, credit cards, not credit cards, things like that. From an emotional perspective, it is having enough cash on hand to cover unexpected expenses is the single biggest driving factor of financial satisfaction. And again, personal finance is about balancing the math and the emotion. So those would be some of the key reasons behind it. I will say that, there can be variations to some of the rules that we kind of base our framework on. That tends to be one that we don't really move on, because it is such an important consideration, especially now when jobs could be uncertain, the economy could be uncertain, things like that. Having that cash cushion of 1 month's worth of expenses has shown to be very, very critical in kind of standing between unexpected events and, racking up very, very costly debt over the long term. Okay, next question, another live question. What's your perspective on 401k loans against high interest credit card debt? Honestly, I think it depends. There certainly could be an argument for 401k loans to reduce the amount of, the borrowing cost compared to high interest credit card debt. What I will say is it's important to kind of think through everything that comes with a 401k loan. So the lost time that you would have in the market, as well as what happens if you change jobs before that loan is repaid. The CARES Act had a few different considerations related to distributions, directly tied to COVID. So I think that probably wouldn't come into play here. But under normal circumstances, if you have a 401k loan, and let's say you leave your job and you have, let's say, a $10,000 balance, then essentially you have 6 months to repay that. Otherwise, it's going to be, a distribution, which would come with a 10% penalty plus taxes. So that's the thing to be aware of, is not just using that 401k loan if you're considering leaving that job potentially, because that could, end up being a tax hit, and then understanding that you're going to lose time in the market with that money as well. So it could work, it could not work. A lot of it depends on how big the balance is on the debt and how high that interest rate is. Okay, time for one more question. Okay, next one. There's a bunch of questions on budgeting, so I'm going to tackle a budgeting one. I need to create a budget. What's the best way and the best app to do that? So I think at the end of the day, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. So I think you need to understand, like, hey, what level of detail am I interested in, and what can I handle personality-wise? And that should influence, like, do you need details? Do you like details? Do you want to be hands-off, or do you need to be hands-off? Do you need to be in the middle? And that should determine the type of approach that you take, whether it be, a line-by-line type budget for detail-oriented people, or if you like a spending target like I use for people that want to be hands-off. I would say, quite honestly, I use the SoFi Relay app. So I'm biased, I work at SoFi. But I think that works very, very well for the people who are in the middle and who want to take that hands-off approach. It may not work as well for the line-by-line people. They may be better served by other apps, like maybe, I don't know, like You Need a Budget, something like that. For the vast majority of people who are in the middle and who, want the probably the most efficient solution, that's what the spending feature inside a Relay is designed to do. Cool. So again, I really appreciate everyone joining.